क्या हाल है ब्रोज। आज हम बात कर रहे हैं डॉक्टर विक्रम संपत के साथ। विक्रम संपत इज अ हिस्टोरियन बेस्ड आउट ऑफ बैंगलोर. He's written about 8 different books, 2 of which got very famous for they were the biographies of Savarkar. The first book was called Savarkar Echoes from a Forgotten Past, and the second one was called Savarkar, A Contested Legacy. And these books went on to become national bestsellers, were acclaimed by Prime Minister Modi, so on and so forth. And I spoke to him because he's come out with a very interesting book called Bravehearts of Bharat. And just reading some of the stories, dude, it's like if this was in my history book, I'd be so much happier. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I had genuinely some of the best times listening to the man talk about circulatory system of identity. That's how I would define history. I spent yesterday, the day before, skimming through parts of your book, and I think you did absolute justice to the theme that you tried to cover in so many interesting ways. And I want to get at the meat from the book at a certain point, but I want to lay some bricks along the way.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I have in that interest is, I recently put out a video where I was tackling a story from the Vishnu Puran and trying to explain it. And either somebody had commented or it was part of the hashtags, it said hashtag Hindu mythology. And then people started coming in and saying, this is not mythology, this is Itihas. And I've been taught to believe Itihas is history. And so I want to understand, because there is such few of your variety who are eminent, who are prominent, who we get to speak to. How do I begin understanding what is history and what is Itihas from a historian's point of view?
That's a great question. I think, even in my latest book, there's a quote that is attributed often to the Kashmir historian, Kalhana, who had written about the exact shlok goes this way, that dharmartha kama mokshanam upadesha samanvitam kathayuktam puravrittam itihasa chakshmate. Narratives of the past, or puravrittam, told to you in a kathayuktam or in a story format, but very importantly, it needs to have an upadesha samanvitam. There has to be a didactic element. There has to be some kind of a moral fabric for society. What is good, what is bad, all those kind of social mores. And in the larger attainment of the 4 purusharthas of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, that is called itihasa. And itihasa too in Sanskrit is it thus happened, itihasa. So our, the Indic way or the Indian way of looking at the past and documenting it has been this, that you don't have a dry documentation or narration of only, facts and figures and succession and all of that. But all of these are couched in a lot of story format. There are a lot of fantastic tales. There is, what is called mythology. But in the midst of that is, the truth, the kernel of the truth is also somewhere, it lies hidden. So a modern historian, while he's trying to reconstruct the past, or while he or she is reconstructing the past, it is their duty to look at the entirety of the story, take away all the frills, all the extraneous elements, all the things which are fantastic, so to say, and get out the kernel of truth. So, for instance, in the what is generally called the Itihasas in India are the 2 epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and the Puranas. Now, the Puranas have all these great, fantastic tales, no doubt. But along with that, there is Vamshavali of all the different kings, the genealogy, the chronological order of who succeeded whom, all that is there. Now, in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, you also have ideas about which were the different tribes, the anthropological groups which were there in India during those eras. For instance, in Mahabharata, in what is the Shanti Parva and the Bhishma Parva, there are almost 70 verses which talks about all the groups in different parts of India, and also talks about the geography of India itself, which is very similar to what it is today. Talks about Gandhara, talks about Magadha, the northeast. It talks about Dravida, Kuntala or Andhra, the different communities which exist there, including, it talks about the Greeks, the Yavanas. All of these are spoken about there. So it's not, while there is all this storytelling that is there, in the midst of that, there is also an element of factual, documentation too, of anthropology, of history, of society, of culture. And so I think that has been a very unique Indian way of looking at things. So Prakhar, I think everything in India, we have a very unique answer to life. We have our own way of how we approach life, philosophy, our philosophy and outlook to life is very unique. We don't follow any prescribed norms set by any other group or country or the West or anything. So
Right.
very similar even with history, in the way our ancestors conceptualize the past. First of all, the idea of the past itself, while the West looks at it linear, we look at it in a cyclic manner, where there are yugas, there are kalpas and all of that. So I think one needs to look at Indian historiography, one can call it, and thereby what you rightly mentioned as how do we look at Itihasa, by looking at this fundamental Indian philosophy or Indic philosophy to the approach to history.
But you said a lot of things, and I would be doing injustice if I tried to condense it. But just so that I have, let's say, a pinnacle understanding, like a symbolic point that then breaks into everything else, is it fair to say that Itihasa is history told from the standpoint of someone with the interpretation and the fantastic imagination clubbed into one? So is it like Sanjay, who's overlooking the Mahabharat sequence?
Right.
The imagination of Sanjay as to all the grandness and the Virat avatar that's happening with Krishna, and also the moral fiber of the whole thing,
Yes.
right? Like the intellectual interpretation of sociology, all of that clubbed into one. So it's not history, because I remember there was a lecture I was at, and this was done by a student at Columbia. He was teaching us the philosophy of history, and there was this hyper emphasis on some kind of objective backward compatibility. Like, I remember those words being floated around a lot. Like, you were trying to tell this as if you were not in the room. You were trying to tell this as if you're a fly on the wall. Sanjay is not trying to do that in some sense, if that is Itihasa. Am I understanding the problem appropriately?
Completely. And I think, so, and the importance of kavyas and mahakavyas, and the importance of the kavi itself, a poet or a kavi in the Indic consciousness, meant many things. Everybody was a poet, not just someone who just wrote poems, but even history had to be written in a poetry form. Mathematics, so whatever we call as Vedic mathematics and so on, you don't have a long litany list of formulas which people had to memorize and so on. So including the Sulba Sutras, from which people say, the Pythagoras theorem and so on was inspired. If you go to that, it's not like, a square, the hypotenuse square is the sum of the other two sides square of the right angle. There is a poem there. And through the poetry, this entire thing is encapsulated. So everything is poem, everything is poetry, and so was history. Including Kalhana's Rajatarangini, which talks about several centuries of Kashmir history, one of the most authentic, documented, records of Kashmir's Hindu past, particularly, is in a poetry form. And there's lots of, fantastic things there. Like, for instance, in my book, I talk about Lalitaditya Muktapida of Kashmir, of the Karkota dynasty. And about him, Kalhana goes overboard. He praises him to the skies. And that, as Lalitaditya went on his Dakshina Patha, or went towards the south, then the mighty Vindhyas themselves, like a hunched back woman, she prostrated in front of him and made way for Lalitaditya to. So this is the, poetic hyperbole, exaggeration that is done, which, you don't have to take it at face value. But then what you need to get, maybe the kernel, is that perhaps Lalitaditya went on a southern expedition. Maybe he touched the, limits of the Vindhyas. So that becomes the dry, facts. But that fact is presented to you in a beautiful way, in a poetic fashion. And maybe that is why, what is the Western model that you spoke of is largely empirical. What is called positivism in history, where, everything needs to be evidence-based. Everything has to, only if there is evidence, it is true, otherwise it is not true. But there, I think it neglects the fundamental element philosophically of what history is, that by very virtue of the fact that it is the past, it is not the present. You cannot look at it evidentially that way.
Right.
Most of the evidence could be destroyed, especially in a country like ours, which has had centuries of invasions and plunder and loot. So a lot of the evidence could be destroyed. A lot of the evidence could be incomplete. It could be biased. It could be compromised, because some court historian is writing something in praise of his or her emperor. And so that is probably biased and so on. So the sources are highly fragmented. They are compromise, there is intervention, and all that is there. So in the midst of that, how do you take, how can you completely base it on that sort of evidential, approach to history? It's a little difficult compared to the West, where probably they kept records in a different way. And another thing, Prakhar, we all the time, from, the Turkic invasions, the Arab invasions, down to the British, all the people who came from outside, they kept condemning us that we Indians do not know. And particularly, they said, Al-Baruni had said, the Hindus do not have an idea of how to maintain their history. And so were the British too, who scoffed at us. But then we, again, as I said, we maintained records in a very different manner. Like I said, Kashmir has a documented history by Kalhana and the Rajatarangini. You go down south, the Cholas, they maintain multiple accounts of their regime. It could be, and in multiple languages, both in Tamil as well as Sanskrit. On the walls of temples, on coins, in palm leaf manuscripts. Same information, triplicate copies, so that if one got destroyed, other two would remain. So they maintained records. The big temple, or the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, which is more than 1,000 years old now. It was built in 1010 CE by Rajaraja Chola. On the walls of that temple, you have inscriptions which have the details of all the Devadasis, nearly 400 Devadasis who danced in the temple, their names, their salaries, their mothers' names, their addresses, which street they came from. All this is carved on the temple walls. And they say we don't know how to document. We, of course, do know how to document. Now, you go also to Assam, the distant northeast, from mainland Delhi and India. Right from the 4th century BCE, the Assam society maintained written records of their society, their culture, and their history. And the Ahoms of Assam, they ruled for 600 years, from 1226 to 1850s and so on. In that 600 long years, what is known as the Burunjis, they maintained inscription, the written documentation of their entire history, their social, customs, festivals, traditions, all of that is maintained. So every part of India had its own way of documenting the past. It's just that it doesn't conform to the Greek model of Herodotus and Aristotle and all of them, or later the British model or the German model, Ranke's way of positivism, which is what modern historiography, the way it is taught at least in academia, is looked at. We did not conform to that, but that doesn't make this approach inferior, or that it did not have the substance of what history and documentation of the past is.
I have found in my intellectual journeys, and I am fairly young, so excuse me if I'm very wrong, but I've found that there is a post-enlightenment obsession with treating everything the way we treat science, which is this evidence-based, fact-based phenomena where, like, you can take something as beautiful as the corpus of cultural stories. They don't even have to be historical. They can be made up, right? They can be completely fantastic, and totally ignore or disregard them because they speak of magic. And on the level at which Harry Potter speaks of magic, we are very okay to analyze and understand and relate it to our lives. But as soon as Krishna enters Virat Avatar, there is a rejection, right? And that rejection comes from, I understand there is psychological imposition that religion might have in somebody's past, and so you behave like that. But I think there is maturity in being indifferent and looking at things the way they're supposed to be looked at before accepting or rejecting. Right, like you look at the text, see what it does for you, and I think there is a concurrent sort of motion where that is happening. I want to get at the historiography and the way India's story has been told, but I have one last question before that. My guess is that a lot of the way in which Indians did things in a unique way was because we were so isolated, where navies had not just landed to India at that point, where it was very difficult to cross the Himalayas and get in until a certain point in warfare and such. But the fact that we did things in an artistic way, where we insisted upon poetry as a means of passing along our history, let's just say, is it because we were an oral culture and poetries, because of the rhyme schemes, are easier to remember, there is some evidence for that? Or is it because we were an artistic culture and there was a poetic essence to, let's say, even a ritual, even our vocabulary, right? Hindi is and Hindi is a surviving, but it's so strange. One word can mean so many things This is not the case as much in a language like English at all. Poetry is somewhat built into Hindi, and I think that's why Indian hip hop does so well, because the words are so beautiful. It's like listening to like a Hindi poetry done in a rap form. What do you have to say about that? I'm just curious.
I think a bit of both. Both are right. Because as I said, everything was, I think we saw the entire idea of rasa, the rasa theory, aesthetics is a very bad translation of that.
Yeah, yeah.
It goes beyond aesthetics. We, at a time when the whole world was probably not even thinking on these terms, or were in a very primitive fashion, we not only defined rasa, but we also spoke about 9 different forms of that rasa, the Navarasas that were there, and how that informed everything. But the Natya Shastra that Bharata wrote, so many millennia before, was the first treatise on dramaturgy, which is not only music, dance, even the entire idea of stagecraft. How should a stage be set up? How natak needs to be performed? All of that. So art and the rasanubhuti, or the experience of rasa, was a very important element, and that's why there was beauty in everything. Beauty in our art forms, beauty in architecture, beauty in painting, beauty in even the way we left our documentation. There's not just someone dryly, some scribe sitting in like a clerk in today's government office, typing away, without any sense of aesthetics or beauty to it. There needed to be that element of aesthetics, even to something considered as dry and insipid as historical documentation. So that is one reason. And the other one, as you rightly mentioned, identified, this whole oral tradition, which is also perhaps, Prakhar, why a lot of our knowledge system has survived, despite repeated invasions, despite repeated attacks. You can destroy institutions, you can destroy our libraries, like it was done. Takshashila, Vikramshila, Nalanda, all our grandest universities and libraries were ransacked. When Nalanda was attacked by Bakhtiyar Khilji, it is said that it burned for 6 long months, where all that was the amount of wealth of manuscripts, of books and everything that were there, which kept burning for so long. So that amount of knowledge was destroyed. But still, things have survived only because, as I said, you can destroy Nalanda, but so many people who have passed out of Nalanda, who have it inside this place, and who are transmitting it through the mouth from one person to the student to further generations. How many of them will you kill? You'll have to have a mass massacre of the entire subcontinent to destroy the knowledge of this place. So while several other societies got subsumed or destroyed because of invasions, I think Indian civilization, Indian culture, one of the main reasons for its survival was also this, that through word of mouth, through oral tradition, the way people actually memorize things. It will be the oldest written document of human history, whether it's a Rig Veda, in not only just the manner in which, not only just the written text, but the manner in which it needs to be recited, the intonation, that also has been memorized at a time when there were no Zoom things to record and keep today we are recording our conversation on multiple devices so that if one fails, the other holds. But in that time, just this adatta, udatta, all these different movements of the hands, through which they said if the pitch has to go high, you have to make a movement of the hand like this, you have to do like this. So that is how these people taught the students in the Gurukula. It's not just recitation of the verse, but it's also the intonation with which that is transmitted. So isn't it so fantastic that for so many 1,000 years, and in the wake of so many invasions and destructions, not only the text, but also the voice of how it needs to be recited, that also has been preserved. It is really mind-boggling, and probably one of the wonders.
So interesting. So
and,
interesting. Huh.
And and in a country like this, where learning could be so easy, to including how do you memorize something, like I said, intonation of a verse. And our education system, we blindly follow the Western model, where everything is rote learning, where things are just very superficial and shallow, where beyond the factual details, we do not get into the
The
meat of the
ras.
matter.
We don't get
Yeah,
into the
the rasas.
rasas. I,
Yes.
I did not know the rasas were translated as aesthetics, because if my amateur mind was to comprehend or contest with the problem of the translation, I would call it anything but aesthetics. I would call it core essence, right? Like rasas are how you feel when you are
Yeah.
exposed to something. At this point, we've discussed the broad constraints of historiography, and we've understood where the origins of Indian historical storytelling differ from the way we've come to see post Enlightenment European storytelling, right?
Right.
And that's a fair difference. I see it very clearly now.
Right.
But then there is a modern way in which Indian stories, Indian history is being told. And that begins sometime after 1947, when we are a sovereign nation, to say the least, right? And my understanding of this statement that you put in the foreword to your book seemed like a comment on history since 1947. Maybe before also, you might be able to correct me better. And you say something to the effect of India doesn't tell its story. And you quote another gentleman saying, we are made, this gentleman saying to you, we are made to appear like a nation of losers in our own history. My question is, who is responsible for making us feel that way? Because there is a sense of loserness built into our history. And what is the point of being a nation of winners? Like, what is the utility behind that?
That's a very interesting question. Well, there's also, in the prologue, I quote Chinua Achebe, who's a Nigerian author, who says, until the lions find their own storytellers, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunters. And that particularly is germane in this entire wave of what is called decolonization, that has been sweeping several parts of the world, particularly Asia, Africa, um, uh,
Latin
uh,
America.
Latin America, yeah. So places which were former colonies, where people finally, the lions there began to roar and said, we don't want our stories, our language, our cultures to be observed from the colonial lens. And we don't want an outsider to come and tell us how we need to look at our own selves, our self identity, our identity as a nation and as a people, as a civilization. We are going to do it ourselves in the way we deem fit. But somehow, and this is a colonization is not just occupation of physical territory or economic subjugation, which is important, which is one major dimension of it. But another very pernicious and maybe deep rooted impact of colonization was cultural and intellectual subjugation, which the colonizers always did, so that the subjects never had that spine to stand. And also that the entire feeling of self-worth. You have Macaulay's infamous Minutes of 1835, which very clearly states that the entire objective of English education was to create, according to him, a vast group of interpreters, only interpreters. They're not rulers, they're just interpreters between us, the British masters, and the millions whom we govern, who are Indian in blood and color of the skin, but they are English in their tastes, in their opinions, in their morals, and in their intellect. And I think how much of that is true even now we can is anybody's guess. It is, we're just Indians in blood and color. We probably cannot even speak one proper Indian language without stuttering and stammering and without bringing English words into it and so on, which is a very, very sad byproduct of that colonization. And one of the biggest casualties of colonization, not only in India but across the world, was history, because the colonizing master had to ensure that the subjects sense of the past needed to be completely deprived of any self-respect, any kind of confidence. So in India, right from that myth that was created of Aryan invasion, which now time and again through genetics, through archaeology, through various streams, it's been disproved. It was foisted on us for almost 150 years as a hoax, one of the biggest hoaxes, that right from your earliest people who were there in this country, who gave you your earliest texts, your entire, whatever tradition, culture, they all came from outside. It was an invasion. So we, as in the British, the East India Company or the British Raj, is just one last one in this long list of people who came from outside. Your destiny as a nation, as a people, is to be ruled by people from outside. You don't have a spine of your own to stand up and be your own masters. You will do well only if there is someone from the outside who comes and rules you. And so the history needed to be crafted around this concept. And that is why, all the stories that we hear are of wars and battles that we as a nation lost. We only keep hearing of one after the other battles where India and Indians lost. Now, if we are around today as the only, perhaps, pre-Bronze Age civilization which is still surviving and kicking, there must have been some wars we won also, some amount of courage that we put also. Otherwise, it's not a stroke of luck that we just ended up being alive. So where are those stories of victories? What were the stories of resistance, of courage, of pushback? There was spiritual, what we spoke earlier, spiritual and intellectual manner in which we were resilient enough to keep up with all the invasions, but there was also physical prowess and physical and military courage which kept us alive. So, but then these things will not be told to you, or they will be brushed aside as folklore, as silly stuff, only to make you feel that sense of inferiority. And this was done by the colonial masters. Unfortunately, like you mentioned, after independence was when we had a golden opportunity to correct this, like how all the other countries, including China, China has a grand Chinese narrative, which is why I think that you can probably have a correlation between how the country takes off, even economically and otherwise, and contemporary, military wise, once the nuts and bolts of your past are put in place and you have a narrative of what your country, your civilization did in the several thousand years of its existence, which we in India did not do. Unfortunately, due to political reasons, due to the worst, the more problems were invented in historiography, thanks to largely the stranglehold with which Indian history was held by ideological, spin masters, the leftist and Marxist ideology, which took complete control over how Indian history was being written. Looking only at the fault lines, looking only at the defects, and not the strengths. Now, every society is a mixture of both positives and negatives. There are defects and problems in every society, but uniquely in the Indian context, it's only the fault lines and negatives that keep getting focused. The positives are seldom focused. Now, of course, there is a very, very thin line between jingoism. Here you have the risk of going down the slippery slope of chest thumping and jingoism and everything about the past is glorious, which is not true. There were defects. But, those aspects of our past, of our ancestors, their achievements, and what we did, what was our unique answer to the world in the 5,000 years of our existence, that genuine sense of pride, that when it becomes missing, I think that leads to the death of a civilization, because you don't have a sense of self-worth. You don't have, an idea as to how, what did your ancestors do? What are the 10 things that Indians did in 5,000 years of their existence? People will just come, oh, we discovered zero and Aryabhatta and those usual tropes that we
Right.
1-mark questions which we probably asked in history.
Right.
But beyond that, do we believe those things? Do we really think that we had a contribution to human knowledge? Do we as Indians really know what are the various elements to different branches of human knowledge or existence or civilization that our ancestors did, that today in the 21st century we can be genuinely proud of? I think that role is also very important, that history provides. As I said, the line needs to be drawn between jingoism. It's a very thin line which goes there, fades away. But the other extreme is worse: inferiority complex, self-loathing, constantly looking at yourself with a sense of being apologetic about your past. that doesn't help any civilization. So when we talk about how important is a winner's history, I think it is important to the end that it gives us confidence in ourselves about how we can sustain our present and look forward to the future.
There is a so look, I come across this so often. I'll be speaking to either Kushal or Abhijit or one of the more intellectual people I've encountered in, say, the historical, social sciences, political sort of spheres, and this comes about very often. The idea that there was a stranglehold, that there was, let's say, that history was hijacked by ideological folk right around the time that India gets independent and starts to create its own narrative. And those ideological folk wrote about the Indian history in a very apologetic kind of a way, where they were pointing to problems. And generally the label is Marxist, right? That these were people from at least Marxist backgrounds.
Yeah.
But to me, what you just said sounds a lot more in line with Hegel and Marx and the dialectic, which is that you should not get jingoistic, you should not be there has to be a synthesis. Marx is more material in his dialectic, but then what they do, because that just seems like a thesis compounding. There is no antithesis, there is no movement, there is no end of history. Like none of that is happening with that model of historical storytelling. So maybe this is a general question I have, because I was once in Dibrugarh. I don't know where I was going to, and we were crossing Naxalbari, and the driver I was driving with was telling me about, this is Naxalbari, this is where the Naxal movement started. I have a history of really touring Chhattisgarh as a kid. My father was so adventurous. We were in woods that were bombed 1 week later by the Naxals back in the day. So I was introduced to this problem very early, and I didn't know who Marx was. I just knew that there is a Marxist tinge to this movement. So Marx has been a parallel figure that's existed in my subconscious forever, and then I finally got time to read about him and such. And it does not look like Marx is either that easily understandable or properly represented in the Marxist movement of India in that way. So how is this history being held hostage by Marxists when there is nothing Marxist about this way of telling the story?
That is that is true. I mean, I think so. India has indigenized even Marx. So including the Marxist movements that have been there in the country, I think they just use him as a euphemism. I don't know how many of them have even read what he has written and said in his life, because this largely. Prakhar, I think the way it comes about, particularly in history writing, if you're looking at, after independence, we just came out of the scourge of partition, and partition was on communal lines, was on solving the Muslim problem, and so the founding fathers and mothers of this nation had this onerous task that the new country that was born should somehow, be kept away from the same communal issues that were dogging it, which caused the vivisection of the country. And they probably thought that history was that tool which could be used to build this new nation, where to actually forge those bonds between communities, particularly the majority and the biggest minority. Aspects of our past need to be purged out, particularly uncomfortable aspects, which is a sad. I'll elaborate why. Because in the thousands of years of Indian history, about 800, 900 years have been Islamic conquests, Islamic invasions, and these were done largely on theological grounds. There was theology that was driving this entire thing. There was the concept of a holy war or jihad against the infidels or the kafirs, and it exists even now across the world. So it's not some medieval concept which is not relevant today. So in this 800, 900 years, we have been a wounded civilization. On the one hand, we had a civilization which spoke, very, very lofty principles. Ekam sat vipra bahudha vadanti. There is one truth. There are different paths to it. Everybody, vasudhaiva kutumbakam, and all of the whole world is one family. All these lofty ideas were being professed by this civilization. It comes into contact with faiths, with other civilizations where there is no inclusivity, where there is my way or the highway. There is some, jealous god sitting somewhere who thinks that if you don't belong to my fold or my club, then you have to be destroyed. And it is legitimate bounden religious duty of the believer to actually annihilate the non-believer. And that's a fact. We better catch the bull by its horns and say it. And as a result, even you had American historian Will Durant calling the Islamic conquest of India as one of the bloodiest tales of human history, not just of Indian history, but entire human history. The amount of carnage, it was many times more than a genocide. Crores and crores of people. Historian K.S. Lal pegs it at about 8 crores, as the number of people who perished in the Indian subcontinent only between 1000 and 1526 CE in the 500 years of the Delhi Sultanate. 40,000 at the least temples being destroyed. Sex trade, women taken away to Ghazni and Afghanistan and different parts of the Islamic world. Women of this subcontinent traded away as, sex slaves. Jizya imposed on non-believers, even at the height of the Mughal Empire. Even by the end of Aurangzeb's rule, jizya accounted to about 15 to 20% of the kingdom's revenue. So constantly the civilization, being under suppression. All of this is a fact of history. But post-independence, how much do you say all this? And why not? The people who were crafting this history for this new country felt that talking about all of this would somehow make the modern Muslim of India today, or partitioned India today, feel a little, uncomfortable. Whereas that was, I think, fundamentally there was a problem there, that they were hyphenating the Muslim of today who chose to be, living in India with the invaders. I mean, they should have been told that these were barbarians as much for your ancestors as a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Jain or anybody else who was persecuted by the invader. Today, when we talk of the East India Company's excesses, we do it openly. We don't think just because their religion was Christianity, will the Christians of today feel offended? But when it came to the Islamic conquest, it was always thought of that these need to be whitewashed. These need to be made palatable for today's Muslims, only because, as I said, the partition of the country was on that question, and to mollify or make a group comfortable, history became the fall guy, where all these uncomfortable elements were brushed under the carpet. And there's only that much of subterfuge and whitewashing that you can do, because truth has a manner of resurfacing itself numerous times. You take a young child to a Hampi or any of our other ruins. In the history textbook, they would have read something else. But there they go and then they see all these murtis in Konark or Hampi, and then they ask, who destroyed this? Why did they destroy this? This looks so beautiful. How could they chop off its head or nose or hand? And what do the parents have to answer to such a thing? So therein comes the fundamental problem, that we've not made peace with our past. We've not been honest with our past. And that is why, even in a person, just imagine, even a person's life, if you had a traumatic past, you need to go to a psychiatrist, you need healing, you need medicines, you need probably spiritual healing also to heal over that wound, and only then you can emerge as a confident and a successful person. So a civilization that has been wounded, how can you just put a bandage and say, oh, this wound never happened, let's forget that this happened? It is going to be cankerous inside, and it's going to keep erupting. And that's why today you see all contemporary battles in politics are fought on historical themes, right from the Ayodhya movement to now, Gyanvapi, there's Mathura, there is renaming roads, there's this, and all the time we are talking only about this. Sometimes you really feel Aurangzeb, Tipu Sultan, all these people are running for elections because, election manifestos are being run around them, TV news debates are around them. If we had made peace with it, and if we had told the story as it was, and we had, truth and reconciliation and moved on from it, and also, dehyphenated today's Muslims and also told them that, these are not your icons. You are not to valorize them. There are people who even now go to Aurangzeb's tomb, including political parties and leaders, and pay obeisance without realizing that he was perhaps one of the greatest monsters of recent times, who killed millions of Hindus, who destroyed so many temples. So why is he an icon for you? Even if you want icons of your own community, there are several people who don't fall in that. Dara Shikoh would be a better example. Ras Khan or Rahim, who had a syncretic approach to this country's culture. Shishunal Sharif from Karnataka, APJ Abdul Kalam. You have enough, people, icons, if you want only from the same community. Why do you have to choose Muhammad Ghazni and Ghori and Aurangzeb, Tipu Sultan, all these kind of, barbarians, and whitewash their crimes and make them acceptable to today's Muslims and tell them that, they were very great and they are your heroes? I think that has been the fundamental defect of Indian historiography. And the group of people, for lack of a better word, you can call them Marxist historians, but a lot of them, coming from the Aligarh Muslim University, who kind of, crafted particularly medieval Indian history and so on. And you had the education ministers of India, particularly after independence, who were Maulanas, who also ensured that this narrative was perfected and almost made axiomatic. This whole animal of Ganga, Jamuni, Tehzeeb, and all these things that are told to us has been a modern creation, which probably, barring a few pockets here and there, it doesn't have too much of a historical, truth, because none of those people spoke about this Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, including their own court chroniclers and so on. So all these things have been manufactured, and we are paying the price for that today. Where, when as I said, when truth resurfaces, people are bound to ask questions. People are bound to ask, why have we been told falsehood? And there will be a group of people who will start trying to find the truth in their own way in the modern times, which is what some of us are trying to do, and for which we face a lot of backlash, obviously, for shaking the establishment that has ruled the roost for so many decades.
Right. I face this question often enough, and recently I was speaking at Mithibai College in Bombay, and they asked me, they were like, why do you think is there such an affection towards Indian texts suddenly? And usually when I describe that, I say it seems like there is a renaissance of the Indian identity, civilizationally, that is occurring as we speak. And therefore, but from what you just said, it seems like what is also happening is that we are really trying to deal with the traumatic wound that we've buried. And now that we unbandage it, suddenly the pain of so long, of whatever we've buried and hidden, is now crafting its way up. And we are contending with it, trying to answer this question very honestly. And I find this to be, I find the West to be very ignorant because vis-a-vis this situation. I quote this incident very often where I was at a party. This was like New York Times, Washington Post writers, some professors from NYU and stuff, mostly very Indian people, but of American origin in some way, right? Or rather, Indian origin people living in America, however people like to phrase it. And then there was a moment where we were all sitting, I was the youngest person in the room, and they were talking about India, and they were talking about India in a conventionally anti-Modi fashion. And I have no affection, let's say, to the political leader in question, but what they were saying is that India is going this way, that way, we need to help, the savior complex was kicking in and so on. And I said something to the effect, I was like, I don't think you understand India anymore. I think the India you're speaking of is at least 10 or more years old. I think what happens in India, and this is because I speak to the masses on a regular basis as a part of my job, as a part of my vocation, I think their interests are very different. I think they're looking at their country and their narrative and their history and their identity in a very novel and interesting way. And I think that is the future of India. I think the future of India is reclamation of sorts. And that is why you have all these renegades coming together, sort of joining hands. And I'm surprised nobody's given them a name. Like, index the philosophical angle. But like, just a name to this crew is going to help market this idea scope so much better. But I think there is something to that effect that is happening real time, and things are changing. And so I've met podcasters, I've met military and defense analysts in Abhijit, and I've met some authors and so on. You're a historian. Like, your job is to actively dig out the archaeological remains of our history in this like narrativistic sense. You have to put things together to tell us who we are. And when the battlegrounds, the political battlegrounds, all historical, it must feel quite interesting. Like, I'm very curious, how is it like bumping across a text that nobody's discussed? And it's been sitting in this library for like 100, 200 odd years. Nobody's spoken about it. You're like, oh my God, this is what was happening in Travancore? Like, that must be so amusing. Isn't it?
Yeah.
Or am I
Yeah.
getting the RAS wrong?
No, no, totally. It's always eureka moments of research. And that is what keeps me going, Prakhar, because, if everything about the past that we need to know is already known, then it becomes a very boring thing to sit and rehash the same stuff. So each book that I work on takes me minimum of 2 years and up to 5 years, 6 years of research. And in that time, it's investigative journalism, like Sherlock Holmes just said, I don't have a Watson with me. I'm a one-man army. So it's
Use
just
Siri,
that.
please. Use Siri. We live in
Yeah.
the age.
So to go, and particularly, the British Library in London, which has the entire, at least of the period that I largely deal with, this Bravehearts of Bharat was an exception. It went into a little bit of ancient and medieval India, but that's not my forte at all. I'm largely concerned with the early modern and modern period from the 17th century onwards. So for that particular period, the treasure trove or haven is the British Library in London, where I think they've taken away all the documents, and good that they did it because it's all preserved and maintained. I don't think we would have done that here. It would all have been destroyed or stolen, or something would have happened in India. So there's just so many things there, including during the research of my book on Savarkar, the 2 volumes, which between them took me about 5 to 6 years. I went to London for about 3 weeks for research. And in those 3 weeks, one is, of course, it's so research friendly, the archives there, unlike again in India, that in those 3 weeks, believe you me, I managed to gather 40,000 pages of documents. 40,000, because there you can take your camera and you can you can
What?
photograph.
You even photographing 40,000 pages sounds like a lot of gold. Like it's like
Yeah, so and these were the entire, Savarkar's time in London in those 5 years in the India House, surveillance, Stockland Yard's entire, report, surveillance reports, the case papers. He fought so many cases there. There was Madan Lal Dhingra's execution, the original papers, and just touching them and seeing them is like, it still gives me goose flesh, that and
wow.
during the I'm working now on the biography of Tipu Sultan, again a very contested figure. When Tipu was killed in the last Anglo-Mysore War in 1799, and his capital Srirangapatna was completely plundered, the British transported his entire library chest of books and documents back to London, and that's there as it is in the British Library. And the Persian and Urdu curator, she told me, unfortunately, I tried my best to learn Urdu, Persian to read. It's a very complicated language, so I'm only midway through it. I still need a person to help me, one dot here and there, and the entire,
Changes.
meaning can change. So it's a very complex language, and it has a grammar of its own mind. So the curator there told me that, including Tipu, every morning he used to wake up and sit in his lavatory quite crazily and write down his dreams that he had the previous night in his own hand. And these were compiled and later translated by William Kirkpatrick as the dreams of Tipu Sultan. But the original diary, with his own handwriting, which he sat there in the loo and wrote, that is there in the British Library. And I got a chance to see that once. And, really, the excitement of seeing that, or I had tears in my eyes, and it was a different feeling. Not that I'm a fan of Tipu or I'm a fan of Savarkar or anything, but just seeing the original history in front of your eyes, a documented version of it, I think it gives a huge high and thrill of its own. And so that is what is that intellectual curiosity, that investigative journalists, joy of discovery. That's what keeps me going in this path. Otherwise, it's a boring thing to keep reading millions of books and then writing something out of it. That's not how
That is the general
life
frame
works.
people have towards history when they study it in school also. They're
Yeah.
like, oh, why would... But the saddest part about this conversation, Vikram, already is the fact that I have to do this over Zoom, because like at so many points in what you say, I'm like, what? But I cannot, because that'll interrupt the flow of what you're saying over the screen. So, this happened to me yesterday when I was reading your book. For me, an idiot, I discover through people like you, right? And so I was reading the chapter on Lachit Burkaphan. Is that how you...
Borpokan. Borpokan.
Borpokhan, sorry. And it's because before I was a student, I was a backpacker. Like I've been to Hampi backpacking, spent 10 days, got food poisoning, admitted to a hospital, like climbed every hill I could find next to Hampi, just like, swam in the waters. I have also been to the Northeast by myself, spent time in campsites and such, but mostly Meghalaya. And then I met a lot of like people from Arunachal, Naga, and I figured they were like, they're a very different type of Indian. Very much like South Indians are very different from North Indians. Eastern Indians are very... It's so interesting. I was like, wow, this exotic, this foreign sentiment that I can get within my own country, right? Like, it's like discovering a new flavor of food that is not present around my boring atmosphere. Anyway, I was reading about Lachit, and there was a mention of the Ahoms, something I was never aware of before. I'd heard the term Ahoms. I didn't even know Assam and Ahom are related in the word, the origin of the genealogy of the word. And that they ruled for 600 years. They put on some of the strongest defenses against the Mughals. Completely like no information ever had come to me. But it began with a Chinese man coming in and settling in Assam.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
It begs the question to me, how do we then decide? Like, you putting that information out, does that not strengthen China's claim to all this nonsense that they from there profess?
Well, it could have if he had established a Chinese empire there or made Chinese the language. Like people who came from outside, the Turks or the other groups that came, they made Persian the court language. They didn't use Sanskrit or any native this one. Whereas this man who established, I forget his name, is quite complicated. It's a Chinese name.
Shupaka?
Uh, yes,
Right.
but that's a Assamese
That's a
equivalent.
translation. Yes,
Yes.
that's our adoption. Yes, yes, yes,
There's
yes.
an original Chinese name which is quite complex. So that person, I mean, finally they became Hindu. They established, Hinduism. They embraced local traditions, Hinduism. They also allowed. They kind of unified all the warring indigenous tribes and so on. But Prakhar, I think the beauty of this, I mean, I didn't get into that much in that chapter on Lachit, but then Assam, when we talk of Assam, it's just not the current political state of Assam, but almost a large part of the northeast, which was part of the Ahom kingdom. It remained invincible to attack for centuries, even before the Ahoms came in. There were these fascinating accounts. So we spoke about Bakhtiyar Khilji. Now he vandalizes Nalanda, Vikramshila, and then goes and occupies Bengal. And from there, he thinks, the northeastern part is a easy, low-hanging fruit, and he can go and attack it. But when he goes there, he's in for a surprise. The ruler there, he's this man called Prithu. Again, someone whom we have not even probably heard of in our textbooks, or even I didn't know about him before. This was the pre-Ahom period. Now, this man follows this entire policy of scorched earth policy. So when the invaders and Bakhtiyar came with about 12,000 horses and horsemen, and he was shocked to see that for the first time he was seeing this, that all the vegetation was burned down on the way. All the sources of water were all dried up and so on. So he and his men, many of them died of starvation and thirst. They were reduced to killing their own horses and eating them for survival. And then they began to take shelter in a dilapidated temple there. And suddenly they look around and the Assamese have started building a blockade all around them. And that is when this guy runs for his life. And contrary to the usual, Indian code of ethics of warfare, that retreating army pe hum war nahi karenge and all those things, Prithu and his army made a mincemeat of the retreating army. So much so from 12,000, hardly 150 or 200 people were left with Bakhtiyar Khilji, and he ran to save his life back to Bengal. And that was the achievement of Prithu. And a few decades later, I think 50 years later, you had a Bengal governor of the Delhi Sultanate, again trying to make an invasion of Tughril Khan, making a invasion of Assam. And you had a ruler then called Sandhya, who again very very different strategy, not directly meet the enemy because they know they are an inferior army, so you bring the enemy to your which is what Lachit also does, military strategy. How do you pull the enemy down to your advantage and then beat him because he's at a disadvantage and you are having the upper hand? So Sandhya escapes to the hills, and then this Tughril Khan thinks, oh my god, I have a free pass and I can occupy. But from the hills he kind of controls the flow of the river water, which they had a great that was their strength, which later even for Lachit it helped, naval attacks. So the entire flow, all the dams that had been built, they just open the walls of that dam, and there is a cascade of water that starts flowing in and takes the invading army completely by surprise, and most of them are flooded away, and so much so that most of them die in the flood. And Tughril Khan himself is caught and executed by Sandhya, who had escaped to the hills. And sitting in the hills from a higher altitude, he decided to control the flow of water in such a way that the invader could be destroyed. So whether it was the Turks, the Afghans, the Mughals, whoever tried to occupy Assam, barring a few later, you had people like Mir Jumla and others who occupied parts of Assam for a couple of decades or so. But barring those small intervals of occupation, by and large, the region remained so self-sufficient. They had so much of natural resource. They had water, the rivers, the Brahmaputra and all its tributaries as the major strength. There had a lot of timber which was available there locally, which they used to make boats. Elephants, which were aplenty in the forest, they were a part of the army. So all of this, galvanized to make it a fighting fit army, completely inaccessible and unconquerable. And that's why Asama, or invincible, is what Assam was, which, because the Sa, even to this day in Assamese, there is no Sa, it is Ha, the syllable is Ha. So Asama became Ahom. So that is how the region itself got its name. And you have Ahomia, which is actually Assamia. So, that
That's
is.
so cool. That's so. When things like this click, it does something. It's like a small little like, oh my god, like it's a release of sorts.
Eureka.
Yeah. Yes. 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 That's so beautiful. But I'm imagining Assam did not mean modern Assam back then. Like I'm assuming that the Garo, Jantia,
Yes,
Khasi,
yes,
all of
yes.
that was part of it.
Yeah.
But were
Yeah.
there like were the Naga kingdoms separate? Were the Manipuri kingdoms separate,
Yes.
or were they all part of the Ahoms at some point?
They were different, because I also have a chapter on a Manipur king, Rajashri Bhagyachandra Jai Singh of the Meiti dynasty. One of their ancestors was this man called Pameba, who actually introduced Hinduism in Manipur, and Jai Singh was the one who introduced Vaishnavism in Manipur. In fact, gave the name Manipur also, which is a very Sanskrit name, and this entire concept of Krishna Bhakti, that started there. Even now, the Manipuri Ras Leela that we have was something that he started, where Sri Govindji's Murti was sculpted. And it was taken from an old, he's supposed to have had, he was in exile because the Burmese were also making attacks, and there were constant clashes between the Manipuris and the Burmese. And so he goes and takes the help of the Ahom king to form an alliance, and he's there in exile. And in his dream, Lord Krishna is supposed to have come and told him that there's a jackfruit tree, you take it and you cut it and make it into Krishna, Balrama, Radha, and all of us, and then install it, and you will actually get victory. Now, when they started sculpting it, it so happened that the wood he fell short of. By the time the sculpting of Radha came to the picture, so he devised a very unique way where he made his own 8 or 9-year-old daughter as Radha and dedicated her to the god. and she was to offer obeisance in the form of music and dance and so on. And that is how the whole Ras Leela tradition came about, and this whole Nata Sankirtana and all that Manipur has even to this day, that was conceptualized and formalized by Jai Singh. So they had a different tradition of their own. The Nagas were separate, but they had a lot of association. Like as I said, every time the Burmese came and attacked, they were the Ahom king would give shelter to the Métis and so on. There were a lot of matrimonial linkages and alliances also among these people. So that was there, but they were distinct ethnic groups, which to this day, I mean, the Northeast is, I think, the most vibrant and diverse, in terms of indigenous communities, which we would call as tribes. And somehow it looks disparaging, but more than 600, 700 indigenous communities, which have their own dialects, their own music, their own instruments, their own dances, all of that, which is very, very unique from the other.
I was briefly lost in somewhere in the Khasi Hills because I do that by myself, at least when I was younger. And I could hear whistles. I could hear whistles, okay? Like from a distance, I could hear. And so when I later resurfaced and finally finagled my way out, I was like, what were those whistles? Because they were not like animal sounds, right? They were clearly whistles of some sort. And he's like, that's how people talk across mountains here. And I was like, what? Why? Like, how do you not tell somebody that? And so, because those are indigenous people who've continued to, like, I have to talk between mountains. How am I going to do it? I have this shrill whistle that I can voice and it just carries and so on. Brilliant. Wow. Because you're talking between trees. It's such thick foliage, right? It's raining nonstop in Cherrapunji and around. But my question is, I understand Khilji getting to Assam, right? I understand even the Mughals trying to do that with whoever they sent. I think they sent
Raja Ram Singh.
They sent Raja Ram Singh, yes. How did anybody get to Manipur at all? Because it's just so much further in. Were they crossing the modern day Bangladesh to get there? Or how were they getting to those parts of?
So there were no incursions from the northern and western side into Manipur, but from the east, you had from Burma, Myanmar. Okay. So that was where they were coming in. So I think beyond this, even Assam, including when Raja Ram Singh you mentioned, he comes with the largest imperial army that Aurangzeb had sent. So many people joining hands, and one of the largest imperial army to defeat a small, the underdogs, so to say, of the Ahom rulers. But one important component of that army was also all these people who could, counteract black magic. Because they were so scared of the Kamrupis. There was Ma Kamakhya there, and Kamakhya, is a seat of Kaulachar and Tantra. Where they were very scared that there'll be witchcraft and black magic and things will be done against them. And so there were all these peers and fakirs who were there along with that army who could counteract any influence of black magic on the Mughal, army. Though, of course, I don't know whether that was the cause of their downfall, but that was a fear that they had about this, these unknown tribes who did everything possible, to protect themselves.
I think for people like myself, consumers of ideas that you manage to produce, condense, or unearth, right? You are the intellectual backbone to a very novel kind of India we are beginning to design. And then there are the faces, which are the leaders. There are political leaders. And even though men like you are now more prominent than ever, you get your fair share of backlash. I've seen that in so many ways, right? You get your fair share of backlash, but it's a symptom of the fact that you are beginning to challenge the establishment in a very proper way. I'm sure this was the case 20, 30 years ago as well. When, let me cite an example. Again, forgive me if I'm incorrect. I think when Subramaniam Swamy talks about the episode where his book on economics was discarded because it was too whatever. And then, he insisted with this, like, this is what economics seems to me. This was back in the day when internet conversations were not bringing things to light, where your Twitter account could not, like, forge your own credibility for yourself. There must have been also political leaders back in the day that carried a somewhat similar view of India. If there was a historical modern historical mainstream view in which India was painted, there must have been people who disagreed, and validly so, in the political space. The faces of this kind of imagination for India, right?
Yeah.
Is there is there any political leader that you think did justice to the idea of India in our past?
That's a googly. I think
After an hour, finally.
no, but I'll still bet. I think the very little less celebrated and unknown person who I think should have got much more credit than what is due is K.M. Munshi, who was a part of Nehru's ecosystem, but constantly challenged him, on especially these aspects that you mentioned, including and probably to an extent someone who closely allied with him was Sardar Patel, including this resurgent India which needed to stand on its own feet with confidence. And K.M. Munshi, probably the manner in which he established the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan and the entire series of writings that came out of Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan thereby, people like Rajgopalachari and others contributing to that, who had a very, very strong, rooting in the Indian ethos and Indian culture and civilization. And they were looking at post-colonial India as that ideal space where there could be a civilizational resurgence as well. And they did it under extreme opposition, particularly from Nehru, including, Munshi and Patel both, were strong advocates that the Somnath Mandir needed to be resurrected. Nehru would have rather resurrected it, renovated the mandir, and given it away to the Archaeological Survey of India so that it's a museum. But he didn't want it to be a living temple, where because that for him was a symbol of Hindu resurgence, and Hindus could not be resurgent for the reason that I mentioned earlier, because your assertion. Every other community in post-independent India can assert itself, can proudly wear the badges of its identity. It's only the Hindu who is called upon to subsume that identity, to somehow lie low, to somehow constantly feel bad about himself or herself, and are a big deal. We had the caste system. We were such a primitive this thing. We deserved what we got. So that sort of a heen bhavna, that inferiority complex, that self-loathing, and that you need to tone down your identity, and including in the freedom struggle, the Hindu resurgence part of it, the Hindu nationalism, which was a very much an element of the freedom movement, particularly of the armed struggle, the revolutionary movement, how that itself was cut down to make it again secularize it, so to say, in the face of such an atmosphere, where including when Somnath was renovated and said that was quite a symbol, 17 times it being broken down by Ghazni and so on, and still it resurfacing each time. Ahilyabai Holkar, who again I cover in the book, kind of renovating that and giving it that pride of place, which these people did, was, I think, despite Nehru's opposition. And Prakhar, I mean, these were political leaders, but what you mentioned today, backlash, this is a long story, particularly in the field of history. There have been so many greats, Sitaram Goyal, Dharampal, Ram Swaroop, all these people who constantly, I mean, at a time when they were mostly in an ideological minority, when they did not have, and the stranglehold with which history was held under, anybody who held a differing opinion had to pay a very heavy price. It cost them their livelihood, fellowships would not be given, your tenured professorships would not be given, you would be victimized. Today, all this academic freedom nonsense that people talk about, what was the same thing at that time? I mean, what was the certificates that you can give to yourself, those who claim that today things are being stifled? R.C. Majumdar, people like that, who were one of the greatest historians of those times. He was in fact commissioned by the Nehru government to write a project, the history of the freedom movement. Now he said, look, I am not going to be a court historian. I am not going to just parrot the Congress party's line of what the freedom movement is. I'm going to bring in all streams. And he was quite critical even of Gandhi and his role in the movement. He said, I'm going to write all this openly. So summarily, this man was thrown away from that project, which was a very important project that the government was putting up. And some bureaucrat who had nothing to do with history, or he had something to do with Persian and Middle East and all this. This man who was in the foreign
Services.
services, yeah, that man was employed, again forget his name, he was employed to become the head of this project. And the government, that was the government's official version of the history of the freedom movement. And RC Majumdar said, hell with you, I'm going to write it anyway. And so he had his the epic magnum opus. He's written the 3 volumes of the history of the freedom movement, which is still available, which lays bare the entire story as it is, being very critical even of the Congress of Gandhi, talks about the armed struggle, the tribal movements, the sannyasi revolts, the revolutionaries, everything he talks about. So that way, R.C. Majumdar could still do it, but several others, these are just a few names. There'd be thousands and thousands of other scholars who either had to toe the line, or they just, probably they lost their interest in the subject itself, or probably didn't do any tangible research other than just teaching in the university. This was the manner in which it's very difficult to even imagine the kind of stranglehold and the kind of resistance and circumstances under which these people operated. KK Mohammed of the ASI, in his Malayalam book, he wrote, especially in the aftermath of the Babri Masjid case, and the case that went on in the Supreme Court, how the left historians played an active role of subterfuge, gave false evidences, false documents. The Muslim side would have been conciliatory and said, okay, chalo, let's have, for the peace of everything, let's sort this mess. But these people kept goading, saying, no, you must go on with this struggle. We have the evidence. And all that was fabricated evidence. None of it stood the scrutiny of law. Meenakshi Jain ji has documented this completely in her book, The Battle for Rama, where many of them, Romila Thapar, Irfan Habib, all of them who appeared in court, they had such flimsy evidences, but nothing is done, to penalize them. And KK Mohammed in that book also talks about how this Aligarh movement held history in such a, stranglehold. Anybody with even a minute dissenting opinion would be ruthlessly crushed. So today, at least, you have these alternative voices, many of whom are coming from outside the system. People like me, who, though we may have our PhDs in history and whatever, but we're not part of the university system. We don't depend on them for anything. Like I particularly, I don't depend on any largesse, either from the government or from the university. I'm an independent researcher. I have a mind of my own, and I'm committed to the excavation of truth as I see it, and bringing it to light to the people of India. And that's the conscience with which I'm trying to work my craft out. So that riles them further. What do they penalize me with? You can't take away my fellowship. You can't take away my salary,
Right.
because I don't want anything from you. So there, then the best thing you can do is make personal attacks, discredit the person, make all sorts of allegations, which will be dealt with in the manner that they deserve to be dealt with, which is what I've been doing in the last several years.
So I'd be at some point I'm going to hit you up again. We'll have another conversation. But until then, best of luck with your book. The link's going to be in the bio for the book. People are going to absolutely love it. I'm going to record a whole intro afterwards and so on and so forth. But thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you,
I'm
Prakhar.
only
It was
grateful.
such a delight. It was a pleasant surprise. I didn't know what I was expecting, or I needed to expect from the interview, but I think it just went off, and I didn't even realize that more than 1 hour, 1.5 hours almost have passed.
120. Yeah, we're at 120.
It was a delight. Thank you. And I think the freshness of the questions, it's shown, and that comes from your very, very thinking and agile mind, which
Thank
is
you.
excellent.
I appreciate that.
So all of you there who have heard this podcast, if you really want more of such content, which is intellectually stimulating and entertaining at the same time, please subscribe to Prakhar ke Pravachan.
जा रहे हो और सब्सक्राइब नहीं किया सब्सक्राइब करके जाना, अगली कॉन्वर्सेशन आएगी अगली वीक एंड इट विल probably be even more fun than this. Can you imagine? It will be more fun than this. If you want really to feed your mind with genuine intellectual questions and answers and how to think about things, this is the place for you. सब्सक्राइब करो और बेल आइकॉन पे